Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jessie Pinchoff. I co-lead the Population, Environmental Risks, and the Climate Crisis, or PERC initiative, together with my colleague, Bidu Mahapatra, who is based in New Delhi. The PERC initiative was launched in 2018 to investigate the complex interactions and dynamics between people and their environment. The initiative helps to ensure that climate programs and policies are progressive, inclusive, and rooted in the principles of equity. PERC has three focused research areas. These are gender equality and adolescent health and well-being, harmonized demographic and climate modeling, and sustainable livelihoods for economic empowerment. As we all know, the climate is rapidly changing. With rising temperatures, increasingly erratic rainfall, and intensity of storms. The effects on human populations vary, but are disproportionately impacting the communities that contribute the least to emissions and harming marginalized subgroups, including women and girls. Understanding how climate shocks, including drought, impact human behavior, for example, through migration or livelihood diversification, as well as health and well-being, are critical for developing policies to address adaptive capacity and vulnerability. To this end, one recent product that the Council has launched is the Community Demographic, or CDM tool. This is an open access interactive web page that displays 4 different models of population projections, incorporating urbanization and migration estimates. And the website includes all of the relevant data and code for replication. The link is available here on this slide, as these models may be relevant to some of the climate researchers and policymakers that are attending this session. And we'd be happy to send more information if anyone is interested. But today we have a really exciting panel. They will share their expertise, highlight some measurement and data challenges, and the persistent research gaps in addressing the needs of marginalized populations impacted by climate change. As we go, please do feel free to add questions to the chat box. We will be having a Q&A at the end of the session. I see there's a chat and a Q&A, so you can use either. I will now hand over to my colleague, Angel Del Valle, to introduce our panel. Angel is an anthropologist based in Guatemala with over a decade of experience working with Indigenous communities on issues related to gender and livelihoods. So over to you, Angel.
Thank you, Jessie, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our session. Well, I'm excited to welcome the speakers that are with us today to share exciting findings around climate change, health, and migration through diverse approaches. We aim to foster a discussion of opportunities and challenges in addressing the needs of the most marginalized populations and communities, as it is the case with Central America, for example, an area that's not only neglected, but usually characterizes by large shares of populations of indigenous people and rural communities. So with attention to principles of environmental justice and data gaps that we can bring to the attention of fellow researchers. As we go, I'll invite our panelists to give a brief introduction of themselves as they start to present. And to open the panel, in the interest of time, we will hear from Dr. Isha Saveri, who's an environmental economist with the Water Global Practice of the World Bank. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I will begin to share my screen and hopefully you'll be able to see the slides in a moment.
We're set.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm Isha Zaveri, and I'm a senior economist in the Water Global Practice of the World Bank and a core team member of the Water Economy and Climate Change Global Solutions Group. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here, so thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion we're going to have. I'm going to very quickly give you a preview of the key findings of our report, Ebb and Flow, that the World Bank launched in August of this year. And it comprises 2 volumes. The first volume that I'll go into a bit more detail, but very briefly, provides the first ever global analysis of the link between water and migration and the implications for economic development. And this is complemented by a regional case study of the Middle East and North Africa in volume 2, which focuses on water force displacement and conflict. And we're really grateful to the Global Water Security and Sanitation Partnership, GWSP, for supporting this work. And you can download the report at the link that you see on the screen. So without further ado, let me just dive straight in. As you all know, and this is familiar to all of you here, migration is big news these days. It has shaped and it carries on reshaping our world in very many ways. And water really has the power to shape these migration patterns. And this is really the thesis of this 2-volume flagship report, Ebb and Flow. With climate change, understanding the water and migration links has become even more important. But as you know, the impacts of climate change are not some looming threat on the distant horizon. They are already happening here and now. And so Volume 1 looks back into the recent past to examine how this intensifying growing water scarcity and rainfall variability influences why people migrate, who migrates, and where they migrate to, with a focus on internal migration. We employed the largest database on migration ever assembled, thanks to Raya and other colleagues who helped us with this, and assembled, along with this, troves of other data sets. What did we find? Results show that repeated water deficits result in 5 times as much migration as periods of excess water, but there are important nuances and lots of buts, and so this should really caution against making any sweeping conclusions. Not everyone has the option to move. The poorest we find are 4 times less likely to be able to move than higher income residents, and as a result could be stuck in a place with diminished economic prospects. But even as droughts and these repeated deficits can trap poor people in low income countries, they do tend to induce migration in middle income countries. And in these places, the volume finds that those who are escaping droughts, they usually possess lower education levels and are less advantaged than other migrant workers. And this means they face lower wages and poorer access to housing and basic services at the destination. Cities happen to be the destination of most internal migrants, but cities are not immune to water shocks. Dozens of cities across the globe, small and big, face day zero type events, when water supplies become threateningly low, yet not all of them make international headlines. And we find that these types of water shortages can significantly slow urban growth and compound the vulnerability of migrants even further. So how can we turn these water crises into opportunities for resilience? Of course, context matters, and the report argues that the challenge ahead is really to embrace complementary and long-term policies that broadly follow the principles of the 3 Ps, which are protect livelihoods at the origin, provide people-centered investments, and finally, to preserve and really sustain water resources. So I'll quickly turn to Volume 2, Water in the Shadow of Conflict in the Middle East and North Africa, which, as you might know, has the highest levels of forced displacement in the world. And MENA is also the world's most water-scarce region. Despite this, and contrary to popular belief, the report actually shows that water scarcity has historically led more to cooperation than conflict. And of course, this does not exclude the possibility of water-related disputes in the future, but it does suggest that we need to preserve and strengthen this cooperative approach. Instead, what the volume shows is that water itself is more often a casualty of conflict, and water infrastructure is frequently targeted during conflicts, leaving hundreds of thousands of people without access to water. So how can the region really move towards water resilience? And the fact is that the reality of a prolonged crisis really calls for a shift from a short-term focus on humanitarian support to a more long-term development vision that delivers and sustains water resources for the millions of displaced people, as well as host communities for whom water remains a daily struggle. So in sum, both volumes really show that the challenge ahead is to recognize the complexity of human migration and acknowledge that the ebb and flow of people always in search of water binds the future of all of us. So with that, let me end. And thank you so much for your attention. And I'll hand it over back to Jesse.
Thank you, Dr. Isha. So I remind everyone, we're a small group, but please, as we go, feel free to add questions to the chat. We will have a Q&A at the end of the session. So now we welcome Dr. Audrey Toholien, professor at the University of Minnesota, and also a faculty affiliate at the Minnesota Population Center.
Thank you. Oh, perfect. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. As Angel mentioned, I'm a demographer and population health researcher. And one of the major strands of my research has been to focus on the impact of early life exposures. And in terms of early life, specifically the impact of exposures during the in utero period on child health. And in terms of the exposures, I've primarily focused on the impacts of climate variables and also infectious disease. And I've done this research both using data from Sub-Saharan Africa and more recently the US. And then in terms of my research, I've specifically focused on maternal and child health. But one thing I want to highlight is that I've focused on early life health, but I'm really interested in studying health throughout the life course. But this is actually one of the ways in which sometimes the data is limited, that like there isn't as much longitudinal data where you can actually follow and study the impacts of climate change throughout the life course. In terms of climate variable, I've looked at the impacts of temperature, rainfall, and malarious condition, which is influenced based on temperature and rainfall. And outcomes I've looked at have been ranged from pregnancy loss to infant birth weight, infant mortality, and child mortality. And I'll just say one more thing. So another reason, well, I've in the Q&A or in the, questions later on, I'll highlight why I've focused on, why focusing on women and children is important. But then this is another piece where sometimes the data has also shaped what I can study. I primarily use data from the Demographic and Health Survey, which really focuses on women and child health, especially children under 5. So actually, this is in a sense where the data has actually also shaped what I study. So now let's go back to actually the first slide. So how do I link climate change and maternal and child health? So there's a few things to think about. First, the impacts of climate can occur through both biological and behavioral pathways. And then there can also be some direct and indirect linkages. So I'll highlight one. So if you look at on the left-hand side, climate, you can see that climate and let's say temperature, like hot days, heat stress can have actually that solid line, a direct impact on the woman's health and also like for children. So that's a direct, and also in terms of like it occurs immediately. But on the other hand, you can also have temperature if it's temperature or rainfall, if it's acting through the agricultural system, there might be actual lag. And then there's also some indirect pathways. And then you have to think about the livelihoods. So people, even with that same shock, people in different contexts may be affected differently. Even people in the same people in the same communities, if they have different livelihoods, may be affected differently. And then even within their household, if their activities are different, they might be affected differently, and then that can affect then trickle down to impact the individual. So for the indirect linkages, when we want to link climate to health, it takes a lot of time to really figure out how to operationalize some of these variables. And local knowledge, or you really have to think about how to operationalize to be able to tease out some of the mechanisms in order to link climate change and health. So now if we go to the next slide, I also wanted to highlight that in my research, timing is very important. So especially since I look at the impact of in utero exposure during the in utero period. And that's to say that the same climate shock may have a different impact whether or not a child's exposed during the first trimester of gestation, second trimester, or third trimester. So in the research, when you can tease out kind of some critical periods, you might find some different effects. So this is why you may have children in the same communities, but if they're conceived at different times of the year, they are going to be affected differently by the climate exposure. All right, next slide. And here, this is just another slide to kind of highlight the different scales or how we think about the temporal aspect when I'm linking the social demographic data with the climate data. So you can think of, like, in the demographic and health survey, I have data from the mother's perspective where I may have some information on the pre-conception period. Then I have the during the 3 trimesters, and then, you know, so, and then you can have data after live birth for the next 5 years. For the child, I tend to have data at birth, so birth weight and so on. And then the last 2 lines, this is an example where I'm going to show the effect of, so let's say heat and drought. So let's take the case where we're looking at episode 2. So let's say that there's a heat shock, and this for the child would occur during the 2nd trimester. So this is a way in which, when I'm operationalize it, if I'm interested in the mechanism of heat stress, I may say, like, hey, what's the effect of this heat shock that's occurring in the 2nd trimester on the child health? But sometimes there's some factors, like if I'm interested in some of the indirect effects, even though the episode may occur during the 2nd trimester, so at this episode 2, if it's occurring, happening through agricultural, there might be actually a lag on the effect. So the impacts may not occur until like episode 2 with apostrophe. So this is just to think that sometimes you have to include lag, and the same shock, depending on the mechanism, may be operationalized differently. So finally, I'm just going to highlight one recent paper that was with Catherine Grace and others that was recently published in Demography. And this paper is really special because it focused on one country, but tried to disentangle the different mechanisms by which some of the climate variables could impact child health. And we basically looked at 3 mechanisms. We looked at the impact of hot days, so the effect of direct impact of heat stress. We also looked at the agricultural season, so like the impact of food production, nutrition. And then we also actually looked at the role of infectious disease, specifically malarious condition, because that's influenced by rainfall and temperature. So certain infectious diseases that are climate driven. So in terms of our results, we found that in utero exposure to hot days, especially in the 3rd trimester, was associated with reduced birth weight. And then we found that if you had better agricultural season, so which was proxied by higher NDVI, so that's the index of plant productivity, especially during the 2nd trimester, that was associated with higher birth weight. And that the mechanism seemed to be likely through the reduced severity of the hunger season. So like see my +1. So there was a lag. And then what was actually really interesting is that when we looked at the effect of in utero exposure to malarious condition, we actually had the surprising result that seemed to be associated with higher birth weight, which was a little surprising. So when we dug in it a little bit more, it seemed that there could be some selection happening where maybe the exposure to malarious condition could increase some fetal loss, leading to, but then also, this is why it's really important to have more local context. When we looked at that malarious condition, especially during the 3rd trimester, being associated with higher birth weight, we think that it's because malarious condition is actually positively correlated with better agricultural season. So like when you have good rainfall, temperature, that like so that there might be some confounding. So this is just to think that just even in one setting where you may have different exposures, there's some complexities there. Right. So, and I think someone put the link to some of the papers. So yeah. So I might put a link to that paper. So I'll stop there and I'll look forward to some of your questions. But yeah, I think overall in my research, I've just highlighted that there's some complexity that people have to think about. And then maybe later on, I may highlight just in terms of research gaps, really being able to dig through a little bit some of those heterogeneous treatment effects that same exposure may have different impacts on different members, even of the same household. So not everyone's impacted the same way by climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Audrey. So now we would like to hand the floor to Dr. Raya Mutrak, Program Director at the IISASA Population and Just Societies Program, and more recently, Professor of Demography and Social Statistics at the University of Bologna. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's the name of our institute. It's International Institute for Applied System Analysis, and then we tend to call it IIASA. Jesse, I could use this slide maybe later on. Thanks. So maybe I can ask you to share later. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So actually, our institute, one of the key things is we try to connect between different systems, because the majority of my colleagues, actually, we have about 200 scientists, not full-time, everyone is full-time, but working, try to connect between, it's an Institute for Applied System Analysis, so between the environmental system, natural system, land use change, agriculture, and our group, we working on population side. So I think it touched upon a bit the topic of this special session, that we want to look at the gaps at the intersection of population and climate sciences. And based on my experience working with other disciplines, I think one strong thing that demographers can contribute, because people do look at population impact on the climate system or the impact of climate change on population, but still tend to look at population in terms of pretty much just population size make a difference. So I think one contribution that we can make, and I always can encourage my colleague to emphasize our expertise, is to look at heterogeneity. We know that, I mean, already since the last IPCC report, the fifth assessment report, which was published back in 2014, there is a bit more attention that has been paid to the role of socioeconomic or demographic factors on mitigation and adaptation. But still, as I was saying, that the connection, when people look at the impact of climate change on population, it's still pretty much about how many people get affected. But what we can do is we can look further into who is vulnerable to what hazards, and also where do people live. And I think that that's a key contribution we can make, because this is, if we are not going to being able to say this, for instance, effect of droughts, maybe it's stronger in the rural or in the urban area, maybe stronger for subsistence farmers, or maybe female-headed households have less ability to adapt, then it would be difficult for policymakers to decide the type of policy that really target the vulnerable population. So I think that's our contribution. So back to maybe connecting a bit with Esha's talk about climate-related migration. And I think one thing that we haven't addressed much, and I also admit in my own work as well, is who migrate. So I think Asia's your work, you already try to look at where do people go to, what type of occupation. But I have to say that the field has already developed also quite a lot in the past 10 years that I have observed. Like there have been more quantitative studies. If you look at literature in 10 years ago, we still couldn't really tell actually does climate events, extreme climate events or extremes, would it lead to increased migration or maybe decreased migration? The evidence has been inconsistent. And I think now over the past 10 years, we have already managed to at least consolidate some of the evidence. So it's becoming a bit more consistent, like Aisha was already saying, internal, so short distance migration, it seems to be the case that would climate experience, negative climatic events may increase migration, but in a short distance, if people migrate at all. And of course, I think the evidence speaks to what Aisha was saying, that it tends to be not the poorest of the poor who would migrate or can migrate, but would be those in a sort of middle income level. So this evidence exists both at the micro level and also the macro level. So if you look at countries, for instance, and also of course not the richest one either, which you may think because the richest probably they may be less vulnerable and maybe they can adapt at the place of residence. So that's one consistent thing that we have. But this shows already that not everyone can migrate or probably want to migrate. So Jessie, maybe at this point we can look at the slides. Yeah. So I thought it's kind of useful also to enter into, if we want to understand who will migrate, to look at this concept of limits to adaptation, because it would link to the differential degree of vulnerability and adaptive capacity. So imagine that so the whitish area is it's an area of the risk that is still tolerable, or one may think that people can still adapt, right? So of course the different level of climatic risk at certain level. Imagine that in this graph, the example is about growing rice or rice yield. So if the farmers experience maybe a bit of irregularity in rainfall patterns or just a slight changes in the temperature, so maybe in the white area, they can still think of changing the crop calendar, so maybe grow the rice slightly after the typical time period that they grow, or maybe change the seeds to more drought tolerant seed, or maybe even flood tolerant seeds, so that these type of seedling exist. But when we talk about rice pollination, if the temperature in the nighttime exceed 32 to 35 degrees, then rice cannot pollinate anymore. So that sort of hit the limit of adaptations. I mean, our rice cannot adapt, but meaning that it's also affect the farming household themselves, right? So sort of, okay, so once you hit that limit, as in, well, the place that you live, you cannot grow the rice anymore because the average temperature has risen to that limit. What do one do? So then it would differ. The choices of response would depend on, perhaps you can change occupation, for instance, to do something else. Or the household may decide to move entirely, possibly. Or maybe choose to send someone, maybe the young, the more educated one, to the city to diversify income. So I think this part on the degree of different level of both vulnerability and adaptive capacity would help us to understand. So then who would migrate or who wouldn't? So it would vary. The ability to adapt would vary between the level of education, level of wealth, the household size, and so on. And so, for instance, we found it's actually linked a bit to your work, Audrey, because I also use the DHS data. I think it's a very rich and powerful data source. So we look at the effects of excess rainfall on under 5 undernutrition. And I was also very much interested in the mechanisms part. So one thing that we try to look at is the differentials between socioeconomic characteristics. And what we found, I think it's quite interesting that children from when the mother have higher level of education can protect actually against children when they experience excess rainfall to fall into undernutrition. And mother education protects to the same level, so really match with the level of household wealth. So mother may be poor, but have higher level of education, then it would be the same, the chance of that their kids are falling into undernutrition, the same as children who come from the rich household, but mother have low level of education. Yeah, exactly. So in a sense, education may compensate also the level of wealth. I think that's that's one key findings. But of course, we may think also that wealth and economic resources are the key factor that determine the ability to adapt or to migrate. Right? So the question of who migrate would depend on the differential degree of vulnerability and adaptive capacity. So here we can also take a look at the second figure, which the next slide, please. Because here I think what this figure is showing, it's then the next step is we have to also to distinguish between different type of migration that we're talking about. So sort of, if we want to tell who is migrating, we also have to distinguish between what type of migration. So I think that the easiest way to distinguish, maybe look between this proactive and reactive type of migration. So reactive would mean we can also think of reactive migration as a sort of survivor type of migration when one experiences things like sudden onset, like storms or flash floods, for instance, that people may be displaced from their place of residence. And in this case, women and children tend to be more vulnerable in displacement or refugee-like situation. In another way, of course, this is also continuum. So we distinguish with different type, but of course, one could transit between proactive. It's not always a clear cut, right? So proactive migration is typically, it's a response. Maybe one has time to prepare. If you experience droughts for the 3rd or 4th year, one may think of migration as one strategy to respond to this drought. So here, the evidence on gender differences are inconclusive, because one thing that we know that women tend to migrate for marriage reason. So it can be that there's some evidence showing that household may decide so child marriage or earlier marriage tend to happen when household experience floods or droughts, because they household may decide to marry their daughter slightly earlier because they have less one person less to feed also in terms of food and security and so on. But of course, it depends. I mean, Aisha did mention about the geographical variation, because depends on the cultural setting. Because if you come from the society where women or the bride family pay for dowry, so in times of drought, actually marriage-related migration decrease also, because you can't afford you don't have a good crop yield, so you can't afford to pay for dowry. So again, I think this is still the areas that after we spend about 10 years trying to look at the evidence on climate-related migration, I think the next step is to really delve into this heterogeneity. That would be kind of the next generation of work. And I think it would start coming out. So that, of course, data is the issue, but I think many of us are trying to tackle on this. I would touch briefly upon this is also another work that I have done quite a lot, is about the role of education in reducing vulnerability and enhancing adaptive capacity. Because I mentioned slightly a bit that we found evidence that education of mother can protect against children falling into undernutrition. The reason why education, and I'm talking about education in general, so not about disaster or climate related specific education, but just giving people a chance to go to school. And we found that strong evidence in at least secondary level of education would really produce the protective effect. And why is that the case? Because we can think of direct and indirect effect of education on human capital, right? Because one thing, so first of all, if you go to school, so directly we learn how to solve problems, we learn how it's improve our cognitive ability, also the perception or understanding of information. We have numerical skills, so people with high level education also tend to have better risk perception, can do the abstract thinking. So that's a sort of direct that having education also can change the way of thinking or knowing how to do in time of emergency. So there's a ton of evidence on that actually. And also indirectly, of course, with higher level education, people also have better access to resources, higher income, higher social network. So in that sense, it's have both sides of the effect. And we found evidence quite consistently actually in both low and middle and high income countries across time, across the level of analysis. So I just want to stop around here and we can open for discussion later on. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Raya. So I remind everyone that you can reach out via the chat box with questions. We will have time for Q&A later on. So now we will go into a discussion based on the expertise that our panelists just shared. And I would like to start with Dr. Ishan. You raised attention to the fact that, contrary to common belief, water risks are more often associated with cooperation than conflict, for example, right? Which also means a need for more comprehensive development approaches to understand prolonged crisis. Can you share with us your ideas on the need for place versus people policies in those settings that are more vulnerable and excluded settings like we have been discussing in regards to climate change?
Thanks, Anil. That's a very, tricky question, and I think also the elephant in the room, place versus people-based policies. So I think as we, go forward with climate change, and estimates suggest that by 2030, upwards of 2/3 of those living in extreme poverty will also be living in fragile, conflict-affected and vulnerable settings. And these also happen to be the most vulnerable regions that will endure the greatest effects of climate change. And so the pressures to move, are here, and these will only intensify. And in places like the Sahel, for example, there is not only exposure to high climatic risks, but there's also worsening agroeconomic conditions. There are reduced economic opportunities. And along with this, we also know that there is an acceleration of population growth. And some people also face a triple jeopardy. So exposure to high climate risks, reduced economic opportunities, as I mentioned, and also the inability to move. And so in these types of settings, what should governments do? Should we invest in these high climatic risk areas or provide incentives to move? And these are challenges that we will have to start grappling with in terms of whether to support people directly, or should we support the places where people live by enhancing the economic opportunities. And so these are this is one of the long-standing debates in economics with regards to people-based versus place-based policies. And in such vulnerable settings, it is tempting to argue that we should create the enabling conditions in these places. But we need to be mindful of the downside risks. There could be risks of elite capture when it comes to investments in large infrastructure. There are risks that we could lock in people with no realistic economic prospects, and we lock in people in places with rising danger of extreme climatic events. So in the report, we talk about this dichotomy and say that in places with these high climatic risks, we really need to invest in no regret policies. And this means building the human capital, really investing in people through education, as Raya also mentioned. And these can act as portable assets that can move with people wherever they go. So in this particular case, what would it mean? It would mean that we do need to provide the vital services such as water, sanitation, education, and health services, because all of these together can protect and build the human capital without the risks of locking people into locations with limited economic potential. So I would argue that the optimal strategy really needs to balance both the short run and the long run trade-offs. And this would entail that, we do need to improve rural productivity and in the short run, because it is often the case that they support the rural sector supports livelihoods for many. But we also need to promote the resilience of communities in the long run, especially when fixed factor supplies of a resource such as water could limit growth. So the question is not an easy one, and the answer will likely depend on the main drivers and causes of the problem, and especially we really need to be mindful of the trade-offs that I just spoke of. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Isha. So Dr. Audrey, you referred to the limitations of data through the life course and differentiated effects in the household, which you were also mentioning in the chat. Can you highlight why the health of women and children in particular are so susceptible to climate? Any specific types of shocks you would like to highlight?
Thank you. So in terms of the research, numerous studies have documented that women and children are more vulnerable compared to men to the effects of climate change and also natural disasters. And I guess one of the first explanation is when we think about poverty. So I think that there was one statistic I saw that said the majority of the world poor are women. And then also in some of the settings that I study, there's a dependence on natural resources for livelihoods. So specifically in settings when it's the women who are responsible for gathering and food production or collecting water and wood, or you may think that then these women have greater exposures to the effects of climate. And then second, pregnancy. So pregnancy can actually make women especially vulnerable to some climate stressors. So in the work that I've done, some of the physiological factors can make the women more susceptible to like heat stress. But then also even to like malaria in terms of like so that can have an impact. And I think another reason is when you think about power and within like inter-household dynamics, you may think that like women may be more likely to reduce their, if there's a food shock, they may be more likely to reduce their food intake and, make sure that the men or the children have that food intake. So all of these different factors make it that in many settings, the women may be more particularly susceptible to climate change. And actually, we'll have a question for Raya to related to this. I had asked in the chat, I haven't studied so much migration. I'm just also wondering when the entire household doesn't move, whether or not the women may be less likely to migrate, let's say, and so they might be more if they cannot move out of the location with the climate exposure. So that's one aspect where I don't know as much, but I would be interested in following up. And as I mentioned earlier in my introduction, even when we focus on women and children, there's still a lot of varying individual and household level factors that can play a role. So it's not all women that might be equally affected. So the role of like marital status, I guess like SES, like electricity, wealth, education, all of those mean that there's going to be differential risks and vulnerabilities, and also like the ability to adapt. And then I also mentioned that when you have families in the same community, so that that economic wealth or that education can have different impacts. And I think I highlighted that even within families, there may be differential impacts. In terms of, I think there was a second part of your question that focused on which types of shocks. So in my research in particular, I focused on like heat stress, I guess rainfall, temperature, rainfall, and I guess climate factors that change some disease condition, like malarious condition. But I think it's been pretty consistent where there's been a wide range of studies that have looked at the impacts on drought, disasters. So I guess it's not my research, but I think when people have looked at other factors, I think it's been pretty consistent that most often it's been women and children that are adversely affected, and that they're more vulnerable and sometimes less likely to adapt. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Audrey. And Dr. Raya, so following up on Dr. Audrey's question, you highlighted that we need to do better at understanding the degree of vulnerability of who migrates, and the need to better also understand who's more vulnerable to what hazards. And you address the conceptual differences between proactive and reactive climate-related migration. So from your perspective, what would be the policy recommendations to be more equipped to address these challenges, these issues?
Yeah, so maybe I link also to the question that Audrey made in the beginning, because one thing is this differential vulnerability, right? So that kind of policy, if we know who is vulnerable and then target that group. So that's one thing. But back to Audrey's question, actually, I don't know, but I can speculate a little bit in the sense, because I think this is still the new field that we haven't addressed much, but I think we start having a bit more capability, I think, to do so when we go to microdata. So one thing about borrowing from migration literature, so women tend to be tide movers. So men moved and women moved too. So in that type of household setting, one would imagine that married women or women who's in partnership would move together to join their husband later on. So that's one setting. But if you think about, I think in many African countries also, female-headed household is quite high, right? The percentage in South Africa, I think it's about 45%. And they tend to be poorer already as a baseline. So regardless of climate effects, then they would probably have less resources if they would have to mobilize and move to using migration as adaptation to climate events. I think that would be my guess. So yeah, so heterogeneity again in this sense, and thinking about the confounding of the characteristics that come together. Where do people live? Their level of poverty, education, gender, cross-cut, actually age as well. I mean, ideally, if we can combine all these characteristics, then we can construct a type of population that is probably, yeah, it actually fits with the topic of this session, to the marginalized in this sense. So it's combination. And I think, so the policy, I have to say, because I'm coming from academia and my policy implication is weak because, and I welcome the opportunity in the future to work more with policymakers, or the people who work closely with policymakers, like maybe like ECHA and then National Population Council. Weak because I think, I mean, it's just what I found as evidence, and I think the policy should probably go into that direction. But because since I'm not a practitioner, so this is only for me that I imagine it should be that way. So for instance, I would think that nowadays we tend to focus in a silo way, or at least what we look, if I look at migration, then I think, okay, let's just look at migration policy, how to look at where people go or where do people come from. But actually that's not the case. Asian's already mentioned that when we talk about, particularly if this is in the case of voluntary migration, then if we think that maybe migration is the last resource that people should do, so maybe equip people with adaptive capacity, capability to adjust in their place of residence. That would be a way to go. But HR also already mentioned to us that maybe we have to think as well that it can also trap people in the kind of high risk area. And I think another field that we haven't done much, but it would have strong policy implication is to look at where people go to. So not only the destination in the sense that, oh, they're moving to the city, that we know people tend to be concentrated in the city, but which area in the cities? We tend to think that maybe if they move into the coastal cities, can be in a kind of poor, disadvantaged housing area, which may be low-lying, so maybe increase vulnerability. But that's what we think, but there's not much evidence to show where do migrants move to, what type of housing they have, probably in low-quality housing or slum areas. So I think that would be the type of work that can probably shed light a bit more, because if policy is evidence-based, and I think that's a direction that people like me who's weak on policy can contribute to, and then we can talk later about the policy implication in that sense. Yeah, but policy has to be evidence-based, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Raya. Yeah, we agree, and that continues to be the challenge. No more streamlined messages, and so along those lines, with the challenges of measurement. So, Dr. Isha, what are challenges or gaps in data to assess human capital and migration and the implications for sending and receiving communities? Can you identify or briefly discuss?
Thanks, Anna. I think, this builds on what Raya was just mentioning. And in the report too, we call for improved data availability on migration choices and patterns for socially vulnerable groups in society. Because migration, we know, can entail additional challenges and hardships for these communities and individuals. And with respect to water, because I sit in the water global practice, there are issues of social inclusion at the intersection of water and migration. And we know that they're very important, but there are significant data gaps, which meant that it was really difficult for us to even provide a quantitative global assessment of the issue. So I think we really need more evidence on the heterogeneity and the distributional implications for the marginalized groups. And this includes gender, but also the indigenous communities and also individuals with disabilities. I think the other one I would say is, the demand, there is a huge demand for high resolution spatio-temporal data on detailed subnational net migration, because if we're trying to assess the effects of climatic shocks and other environmental stresses, which are available at that scale of resolution, there is a huge demand that even the socioeconomic variables need to be at a similar, high spatial resolution. So without having that, it can hinder, the production of very accurate and comparable estimates of migration across regions. And in the similar fashion, as I mentioned, we also need fine-scale socioeconomic data. Those are also scarce. They are typically at subnational scales, and then they require downscaling if a more refined scale is needed. So there is work in this area. It's emerging and growing work using machine learning and other AI technologies to get at this, but we need more data at those scales. And I think lastly, if I could mention, that there's this whole question of stayers and movers, and we know that the exit ramp is not available to everyone. And I think one of the migration field's blind spots are that oftentimes the research focuses a lot on the movers. We need to know a lot more about the stayers and what happens, the choices that lead to that type of decision. And depending on the context, of course, it could not just be the environmental shock itself. It is, as Raya mentioned, it's the vulnerability and the adaptive capacity to cope with that shock that ultimately leads people to actively choose to migrate or not migrate. And so I think understanding that mechanism, the interactions between environmental stresses as well as adaptation strategies and the decisions the decisions that people take to not move, I think are also ripe for research and just additional work in that area. So I'll end there. Those would be some of my reflections. Thanks.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you. So, Dr. Audrey, from your perspective, what are the gaps and barriers that social scientists like yourself face when incorporating climate change into your research experience?
Thank you for this question. And so I'm able to study the impacts of climate change. That's because the demographic and health data sets that I use include spatial identifiers such as latitude and longitude coordinates, and also administrative names such as district and regions. So could you put the slide, sorry? And the keys, so basically, some of those social demographic data set come with some spatial identifiers, so geocoded points, but then there's others that don't have sometimes the geocoded points where they may have the district name or region, and that still has some spatial information that you can merge. But so I guess, and that's because in my research, once I have this spatial identifier, I tend to use high resolution or detailed remotely sensed data that has a lot of these climate indicators. But then I just really want to echo what Dr. Isha said, that like one of the biggest challenges is actually, it's really important to match kind of the spatial and temporal scales in these social demographic data sets with the climate data sets. And it usually you want to have the finer scale is better, just to be able to kind of see that disaggregated, some of that subnational variation. But this is where there's one challenge where sometimes being able to do that, there can be a lot of spatial data wrangling. So I feel like in my research, collaborating with geographers or using special software, but then also this is, I'll plug in one point, but this is where folks like the DHS and IPCC2021 at Minnesota have started to add some contextual variable to those individual microsamples. And then also places like CSIN and the NASA CDAC, like basically there are resources or people who are actively trying to put some of that climate data in a way that social scientists can easily merge it to their individual level observation. It's always easier when you have those geocoded, but also increasingly at some of these administrative boundaries. Could we go to the next slide? So I just want to highlight why spatial scale matters. So here there's 3 figures where it's the same exact data. So the yellow, green, orange is the same, let's say, climate data, but at different spatial resolution. So on the left-hand side, you have highly detailed spatial variation where you can see some details. And let's say the 2 dots are demographic and health data, so 2 individuals. So on the left-hand side, when you have detailed demographic and fine-scale geographic data, you see that these 2 neighboring dots are associated with different climatic conditions, right? But as you increase the resolution, or it becomes more coarse, the climatic data, then you see one issue that can happen where now these 2 neighboring geocoded points are actually assigned the same climatic exposure. So then that actually will make it in your research very difficult to look at the impact of an exposure on, let's say, if you had information on child health and so on, just because, so this is just highlights the need that you really need to be able to match the data accurately. So could we go on the next slide? Conversely, this is just to highlight that sometimes you have challenge when the social demographic data is at really coarse scale. So let's say we did not have these individual geocoded points, but we had information on the administrative boundary. So if you have information under, you're just given the region name or district name, then, and as I said, oftentimes the spatial data is at a fine spatial scale, then you're kind of forced to aggregate across, let's say, the whole area of this square. So sometimes that might be okay, but then it's really problematic if the settlements or the population are not evenly distributed within the administrative boundary. So in this case, if all the points are actually at these really green squares, if you had an average of that, if you had an average from the entire administrative boundary, that would be misleading. So this is why we're sometimes like if people have geographic weighted averages, so working with geographers, things like that can help. But in terms of research, the fact that the DHS has the geocoded points for the cluster is one reason why DHS data is used often to study the impact of climate change on some health aspect, while the multiple indicator cluster survey has some very similar information, but in the mix, they only provide the administrative information, not the geocoded information. So people don't use that data often. And then the final point I want to highlight is that in my research, another challenge is that since I'm using survey data, it can make it difficult to identify which individuals, so kind of that temporal scale, are exposed to the climatic event. And the first reason is mortality selection. So when I have a survey, if I'm looking, I'm surveying people who are alive at the time of the survey. So if I'm interested in the impact of a climatic exposure that happened in the past, if that climatic exposure was severe enough to cause some mortality, then I'm only measuring the impact of the shock on the survivors. And then another selection aspect is the migration selection. So when I'm studying the impact of a climate exposure at a specific location, I only have the people who haven't moved. But I guess also you may have people who have moved to that location. So having some information on migration history is really important in order to really isolate, like, oh, in this specific location, who was exposed to this climatic shock or this climatic experience. Because if you only have the people who are not able to migrate, that might not paint a full picture of the impacts. Or likewise, if you have people who have migrated into that region, you may, but you don't have their migration history, you may not really understand the impacts. So these are just some challenges that I face in my data.
Thank you, Dr. Audrey. And yeah, I think what we've heard so far is interesting that we have yet to grasp the use of the cultural information that we can gather, as you were mentioning, the information on migration history and the intergenerational differences that are quickly changing within a family, within a household. So Dr. Raya, a question for you before we move on to our Q&A. And along the lines of data and measurement challenges. In your opinion, how can we move forward to provide better understanding on who migrates, who stays, who gets trapped, along the lines of what Dr. Aisha was saying about the blind spots?
Yes, so actually, Jessie, please stay on this slide, which is the order slide. I just first, before answering the question, I just want to add another layer of difficulty before moving on to see how can we tackle this. So the complication, right, of the climate data, which tends to come at the raster level. Now, when we talk about migration, I mean, it depends. The interest tends to be, we need a geographical boundary, actually, to say, where people come from and where they move to. And we can draw the boundary. Typically, we would use the administrative boundary, right? So sort of, particularly if a countries have state and maybe province and then maybe county, for instance, if the data comes in the county level, then hang on. So migration, we would capture probably more, right? Because it's the smaller the scales it is, the bigger the scale, then people have bigger distance to cross. And I think that is one challenge from the migration side, like how maybe if you want to quantify, we want to know, then the scales matters quite a lot. But it's also, we are so confined by the data. So we may over or underestimate migration in this case? Actually, our work that we did the report for you are also bounded by this geographical administrative unit of different countries that we use. Sometimes we pick higher or lower migration just because of the boundary issue. Though we try to wait for it, that's one. But secondly, the question can be, if we think about what climate can happen within or between the boundary and the neighboring. So if you think about the health effect, I think it's complex, but it's still more straightforward, because probably if you get affected by say the heavy rain, so you might really fall ill or something. But migration, because if it's linked to livelihood, maybe your livelihood depends on your local context, but also the neighboring context. So maybe the climate condition of the neighboring, or even of the 2-3 villages away, because you probably import food from there and so on, may affect you. So I think that's a layer of complexity that we always have to think about when we think about livelihood impact and also migration. And to answer your question, how do we address the data challenge? So one thing, actually, we can still live with the data that are not geocoded. I think subnational is good enough. Of course, I just mentioned that we have the issue of the boundary, but it's still good enough to be able to capture something. I think the effort to at least also socioeconomic data with the subnational data, it's useful. So for instance, I think certain surveys that are not designed for us to work with environmental change or climate change, I think if they are able to provide some of the location where people live. For instance, in Europe, we have this gender and generation survey that targeting, looking at fertility intention, families, maybe childhood outcome and so on. But they tend not to give out easily where do people live, or not collecting. So I think moving forward in the survey, make it easy just to connect where people live. If it's not, even it's not geocoded, it's already useful. Secondly, I think there's still many data sources actually that are untapped and can be used to capture not only migration, but some kind of vulnerability as well. For instance, the World Bank actually have a website that collects the microdata and longitudinal ones, such as this household income survey, expenditure survey, food survey. And it's a micro level. I think we do know some kind of location where people live, so we can match with the climate exposure. And I welcome PhD students or whoever to look at these untapped data sources. One good thing about working with climate-related issues is, even though it's cross-sectional, we can still match with the climatic events or environmental change event that happens before and look at the outcome. It's not ideal, but we can do that. So I think it's not so pessimistic. We can improve, but we can also already work with what we have. So I'm going to stop here too.
Thank you, Dr. Ryan, and thank you to all our panelists for their expertise, and that left us enough time for Q&A. So over to you, Jessie.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us. If you have to drop off for other sessions, here's some contacts, and we can also connect you with any of the speakers if you have specific questions that you're not able to stay on and ask right now. But I will open it up to everyone on the call, panelists, anyone in the audience. If you have any questions, you can feel free to, we're not a huge group, so if you want to just unmute yourself to ask the question, or you can raise your hand. We can also read questions from the chat. Any questions to kick us off? I saw one in the chat. I know, Isha, that you answered it, but I thought maybe we could answer it out loud. We had a question about the research methods that you use to examine correlations between water-related events and migration.
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned in the chat, we're using econometric methods to isolate exogenous changes in water availability, and we specifically look at exogenous variations in rainfall shocks. And this also has, in turn, has an effect on sort of water supply shocks. So when we looked at the day zero events that I had described, we also focused on urban water supply shocks. But we use these climatic shocks as a means to plausibly identify the causal relationship between them, as well as the migration outcomes that we're interested in. Thanks.
Thank you. And then Raya, we were wondering, can you speak a bit more on the linkages with education that you mentioned, some of your work around education and adaptive capacity?
Yes, so we are looking at all sort of outcome actually is related to climate related risk. For instance, disaster preparedness, risk perception, and also what do people do if during the time that they experience climatic shocks, and then the recovery. So it seems to be that education do give some protective effect in all of these type of outcomes. Also, people tend to have less better well-being in terms of mental health and so on. And then the interest is to dig further actually. So why this is the case, to try to unpack a little bit what does education do. And I have this one work that look at disaster preparedness in the Philippines and Thailand. And we found that it went through the channel of risk perception. So higher education sort of, especially in the case of disaster preparedness, so being prepared for floods, or for in Thailand case, we look at the coastal area, also in the case of tsunami and so on. It seems to be that with higher level of education, they tend to have a better risk perception. Particularly, it compensates actually the disaster experience, because one may think that if you have disaster experience, then you prepare for the next one. So we look at people without any disaster experience, and education can really match the higher level of schoolings. It would match about 15 years of schooling. The level of disaster preparedness would match with the same level of people who has experienced disaster before. And it also go through the channel of social networks as well, because you may think that with social network, you may spread out the information and what to do and so on. Yeah. And also in the case of India, that we look at mother education protecting against undernutrition, it also go through the channel of health knowledge and health use. Yeah. So it seems to have evidence around that.
Thank you. All right, are there any other questions? I had a quick question for you, Audrey. Just in thinking about some of these exposures and the time points at which they occur, and then whether in your work, if there's methods or data that you're using to think about sort of the causal links with things that you might see further down the line. So in utero exposures, and then if there are links with health effects in early childhood.
Yeah, so in the research, and this is why sometimes with the DHS, I would love to have some more detailed information past age 5, or really trying to do a better job looking at some of the educational effects. Because for instance, when I had that slide showing the impacts of trimester of exposure, so the second trimester by the second trimester of the exposure, most organs are formed, but that's the period where you have really rapid brain development. So there's been some research that's shown that if you have shocks that particularly impact that second trimester, you tend to, for instance, not see so many impacts on, let's say, birth weight. But then if you have some information about testing, or educational testing at ages 8, 9, 10, then you might see some of that effect. So I think, so I think having data sets that allow you to really look at some of those shocks over time. And then I guess also with some of the longitude or looking at some of the life course, I would sometimes you see some effects that are evident with health at birth, but then it may not always be the case that those effects may stay. So this is where it would be really interesting to keep on looking at like the role of parents' education or SES, whether or not we see maybe some of those negative effects, like if certain children are able to adapt or catch up, from their vulnerability. So I think, so these are some of the things that I think about, that like, I do think that you do, like, to the extent that you can, it is important to maybe try to separate out. So I guess trimester of exposure, but then sometimes people beyond that, sometimes you want to look at the impact on the mother, like prior to conception. So then there's the gestational period, but then also early in life. So the first year may also be vulnerable. So maybe might not, so there are multiple, I guess, depending on what you're interested in, there may be multiple periods of vulnerability. And something else that I haven't studied as much that I think may be understudied is the adolescent and puberty. I think like physiologically that may also be a period of a vulnerable period. So I get physiologically, biologically, but also socially, that might be also an interesting period of time to look at for the climate change and health. Oh, one plug that I do want to say. So now I've noticed that at least for the DHS, they have started getting more anthropometric measurements for adults, for men. And then also in some surveys, I've seen they've increased the range of people that they survey. So for example, in Haiti, I think the most recent survey actually even took like blood pressure and other measurements for, I think, adults maybe in the 50s and maybe even 60s. So I think that may start to be interesting to actually look at the impact on some of the older age groups. And as I said, the DHS had historically been on fertility, so had focused on a smaller age group, but surveys that let you study wider age range. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Justin, maybe I can reflect a bit on this because I think one thing that we tend to still look, apart from looking around children, but also the issues that we tend to look at the impact of climate change on nutrition, but on the undernutrition side. But we know that actually in many parts of the world, overnutrition it's probably almost taking over the undernutrition, or it can be the double burden, right, of a triple burden actually of this malnutrition. Maybe in the same household you may have the mother overweight but children underweight, and then so on. And I think this new DHS that we can also look at the adults anthropometric and possibly our work. So we tend to slightly focus more on the rural area, but less so on the impact of climate change on the urban area, because we do think that the effect goes to agriculture. So I guess something around that may keep us also up to date to development in other fields. Like in epidemiology, we know about overnutrition is also an issue, and it probably go through the channel of income change and so on. And I think that would be something to tap on. Not in the future, in the near future.
Yeah, and a quick plug for one other data set. If we're looking at nutrition questions, I know the performance monitoring, the PMA 2020 surveys, I've worked with some of them, and they use the mid-upper arm circumference or MUAC score for children, and also for adult women. So that can be used as an indicator for nutritional status. But it is great if increasingly they can include some of those easy, quick field-based measures.
Yeah, I would agree. I was just saying at this, so I guess I'm a big plug for folks at Minnesota that work with some of the PMAs. So the PMA, and then also for the World Bank's LSMS, the ISA. I have some the grad students have really explored some of that data set, especially some of the longitudinal aspects of that data set. Yeah, it's both great.
Great. And I think we have a question, Lei Wen. If you're able to unmute. Lei Wen, you can use the chat if you're having challenges with audio. Okay, well.
While we're waiting for Lewin, I just want to say thanks, Raya and Audrey, for making the plug for LSMS. It is a amazing data set, a treasure trove of surveys from across various regions and countries, and they're constantly adding to these as we speak. So it is a treasure trove for all grad school research and other research in this area. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Sorry, Lei Wen, if you have a question for one of our speakers, I can definitely connect you to be able to ask it. But on that note, I will just say thank you to all of our panelists, to our moderator, to everyone for attending. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. So Lewin, let's connect it later. Nice to see you all. And hopefully next time in person.
Yes, hopefully.